Uh, a big thanks for getting rid of plastic bottles from this podium and from GALF in general. Thank you. Yes. Okay. I'm delighted to be here with Tony to talk about this book, Early Indians, the story of our ancestors and we came from. And as Vivek just mentioned, this book has been a big success. It's got rave reviews. It's in its eighth reprinting already in less than a year. And it's won a number of awards. And so congratulations, Tony. I think a big reason for its success is that Tony has presented in with really admirable clarity and the right depth the latest peer-reviewed science on human migrations and our genetic ancestry. And he has tied it all together with findings from archaeology and linguistics. I think it's an exemplary work of science journalism, I would say, that's helping put to rest some of the most contentious debates in Indian prehistory. Now, normally, in most countries, only a few specialists worry about their prehistory, but India is no ordinary country and we Indians are no ordinary people. Especially in India, many questions of prehistory have become deeply entangled, as you know, with a certain kind of nationalistic imagination and communal identities. In particular, the issue of Aryan migration and the origins of what many see as the foundations of Hinduism, like the early Vedas, Sanskrit, and more. Now, what makes Tony's book quite unique from previous books on the Aryan migrations is that it relies heavily on the new field of archaeogenetics, or the study of ancient DNA, to make sense of migration patterns. So, unlike archaeology and linguistics, ancient DNA analysis is much closer to a hard science in that there is not that much room for diverse interpretations. It's very clear. You know, in a way, it is doing to the study of the past what the invention of radiocarbon dating did back in 1949. So Tony, let's dive right in, and perhaps you can begin with a quick review of the various migrations that have happened, come into the subcontinent. So let's start with the first migration of modern humans out of Africa, roughly 70,000 years or so ago. What happens then?
I would like to, good question, and thank you. And
Mike.
I would like to situate the migrations. The migrations that shape the Indian demography in the migrations that shaped world demography, because it's important to know that the book focuses on South Asia because we are in South Asia, but the fact is that in the last few years we have had a dramatic and clearer understanding of prehistory around the world. We know how different populations formed in Europe, in the Americas, in Southeast Asia, everywhere. And the part that we look at South Asia is only part of it. So let me first paint a broad picture of the migrations that shaped world population. We know today that all of the human population outside of Africa came from Africa. How do we know this? Geneticists have looked at the DNA of everybody, and they can see that the entire population of modern humans outside of Africa, they come from a small subsection of the African population. So in fact, therefore, the African diversity in the genetic pool is far higher than the rest of the world, because that goes back a long way. We also know roughly at what period of time this migration happened. Again, by looking at, we can figure out how long ago this genetic divergence happened. And that's around 70,000 years ago. So what we know now is around 70,000 years ago, a subsection of the African population, not more than a couple of hundred people perhaps, moved out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula and then went on to populate all of the rest of the world. And the last continent that they populated was the Americas, and that's happened around 16,000 years ago. So between 70,000 years ago and 16,000 years ago, the out of Africa migrants populated the entire world. Now you could call this as the first class of migrations that shaped world population, the first class of migrations that shaped world population. And the answer to the question, who are the first Indians, who are the first Chinese, who are the first Australians, who are the first Americans, all of that is the same. They're all the out of Africa migrants. Those are the first wave in this period. Now, as these modern humans were spreading across the world, a major thing happened, which is that a glacial period intervened between around 29,000 years ago and about 12,000 years ago, roughly, and which meant large parts of the world became uninhabitable and populations got separated from each other, which also meant that different population groups in different parts of the world grew slightly along different lines, accumulating minor genetic differences. We should remember that 99.9% of the DNA of all modern humans, even today, is the same. So that's what happened when during those the first out of Africa migrations that filled up the world. Now comes the second class of migrations, and this happens when the glacial period ends. And what we see around the world are different population groups experimenting with agriculture. Temperatures went up by on an average by around 7 degrees Celsius when the glacial period ended. And we can see many different population groups experimenting with agriculture. In fact, the earliest agricultural experiment might have been with tubers and bananas in Southeast Asia. But the important thing to remember is that not all experiments were successful, not all those experiments that were successful were sustainable, and not all those were successful and sustainable didn't make a big difference. Like the tubers and the bananas did not make a big difference to your living standard or living style. But those population groups who were in geographical areas where they had the opportunity to cultivate cereals, wheat, rice, barley, they found themselves to be very lucky because it was sustainable, it was also very productive, and they could change their lifestyle and become farmers and settle down. And when some of these groups became farmers, what happens next is dramatic. There's a huge population explosion because there is no comparison between the way hunter-gatherer populations grow and farmer populations grow. And the natural result of those population explosions are migrations. So these early agricultural experiments happened and farming revolution happened in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in India, China. These are the major regions. And what happens is a major population expansion and migrations that shape very large parts of the world. So this is the second class of migrations, all linked to modern humans taking to agriculture. If the first class of migration was shaped by climatic factors, the second one is shaped by modern humans' actions in terms of agriculture spreading. The third class of migrations happened much more recently as in 5,000 to 4,000, 5,000 to 3,500 years ago. And this happened when a group of population in Central Asia mastered the art of riding a horse and combined it with mastery over metallurgy. And you should remember that this is a dramatic development for modern humans in terms of the mobility that offers. And you can move into areas already populated by farmer populations and dominate it quickly. So you see this population from Central Asia moving into Europe, into around 5,000 years ago, into South Asia, and West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, all across, cutting across to China. You can see that population moving across and coming down to South Asia between 4,000 to 3,500 years ago. This is the third class of migration. We are not finished. One more. The fourth class of migrations we now know are, we all studied it in history classes. We all have in various ways been affected by it, which are the colonial migrations. And that shaped the demography of large parts of the world, from the Americas to Australia and many other parts of the world. This happened because some groups of modern humans figured out how to travel large distances in seas and invented steamships, and figured out they could get into new areas and dominate them. Now, so these are the four classes of migrations that shaped world demography. What about us? What about South Asia? First thing to remember is that the last class of migrations, the colonial migrations, left almost no mark on our demography, because the number of people who came as migrants were too few compared to the population to leave a mark. But the other three classes of migrations affected us. And one of those classes of migrations, there were two migrations. So in all, three classes of migration, but four actual migrations is what shaped the Indian population. I'll finish it in a few. So the first class of migrations is the out of Africa migrations, which reached India around 65,000 years ago.
Okay, that's one.
The second migrations that shaped Indian demography is a population that is connected, that is closely related to the agriculturists of Iran, especially in the Zagros mountain region. They mixed with the population of the first Indians who arrived here 65,000 years ago, and it is that combined population that created the agricultural revolution in the northwestern part of India, which over thousands of years became the Harappan civilization. So this would have happened sometime before 12,000 years, around 12,000 years ago.
So around 10,000 BCE, this migration happens into the subcontinent. They mix, and this mixed population then takes over the entire subcontinent in subsequent millennia.
As of now, what we have to see is that we have evidence of the earliest agricultural site is in Mehergarh in today's Balochistan in Pakistan. That dates to around 7,000 BCE or 9,000 years ago. And we can see from the archaeological record how quickly, or the next few thousands, is spreading across the whole of the northwestern India up to Gujarat. And from that grows the Harappan civilization. As of now, they are not necessarily moving into all of the rest of the India, but agriculture is spreading. So much so that at the height of the Harappan civilization, which is around 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE, it is the largest civilization of its time, as much as Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations put together, both in terms of area and population. So you have to see, agriculture began, and obviously, as it has happened everywhere, it led to a huge population expansion, and that happened. The next question is, what happens after that?
Yes.
Around 1900 BCE, the Harappan civilization begins declining because of a long drought. Okay, let me step back a bit. So we so far talked about two migrations, right? With the out of Africa migrations, the West Asia. There is the third migrations that happened from East Asia, which we normally do not talk about, or because there has been far less. This is not somehow exciting for media to focus on. But there is a third migration that happened from East Asia around 4,000 years ago. And these brought what is called Austro-Asiatic languages. These are languages such as Khasi and Mundari that are spoken by tribals in central India and eastern India. And the fourth migrations that shaped Indian demography are what we talked about just now, which is from Central Asia, which arrived after. So to answer your question, the Central Asian migrations arrived, we now know from genetic evidence, ancient DNA evidence, that happened between 4,000 to 3,500 years ago, which means they arrived here after or around the same time as the Harappan civilization was declining. And what happened then is that,
So these are the Aryans.
That's right.
Roughly, they entered the subcontinent by 1500 BCE.
Between 2000 BCE and 1500 BCE.
Okay, so there is a range of a few hundred years.
Yeah.
And they are a nomadic pastoralist people.
Yes.
They speak a Proto-Sanskrit.
That's correct.
And they have a social hierarchy, a sort of early Varna system with Brahmin priests at the top who perform fire rituals. They also have an oral tradition of chanting verses like those in the Rig Veda. All of these, Sanskrit, Brahmins, fire rituals, Rig Veda, are now seen as the foundations of Brahminical Hinduism. And this all came through a migration.
I would disagree with one part of it. It's not clear that there is a caste system at that point of time. It is clear that there are people who take care of the rituals.
Right?
Yeah, caste system is a later development. But yeah, the Indo-European languages were brought by people who called themselves Arya, and between this period, and this explains how Indo-European languages are spread around the world as they are. They are spread. Indo-European languages today are spoken by 40% of the world's population, and it ranges from Iceland in the west to India, or to be more accurate, Bangladesh in the east. To the east of Bangladesh, you cannot find any Indo-European language speaking group, and so this is the spread. How did the spread happen? And that's what the migrations from Central Asia into Europe around 5,000 years ago, which we know from ancient DNA evidence, and into South Asia around between 2000 BC and 1500 BC. That's what explains the spread of Indo-European languages, which include most of the North Indian languages, Persian, most of the West European languages, almost all of the Western European languages, except for Basque. French, Italian, all of that. So that's the spread of the Indo-European languages, as we know, and that's what this is the migration that explains it.
Okay. So in recent decades, of course, there's been this competing theory, although it never really had very much scholarly support, but it somehow had become an article of faith for so many people, especially urban professionals. The so-called out of India theory, and just to very quickly define that, the OIT posited that Aryans were indigenous to the subcontinent, that India is the original homeland / mother of all Indo-European languages, including Sanskrit. And the migration happened out in reverse, with indigenous Aryans going to its west, to the west, and this also implies that the Harappans spoke a Proto-Sanskrit. Now, this never really, even based on archaeology and linguistics, this didn't really make sense, didn't quite have that much support, and they were exploiting some gaps in the knowledge that we had. What motivated the support for the out of India theory, and why did this survive so long?
First of all, I think it must be recognized that the out of India theory has never ever been supported by anyone in the proper scientific community. Not a single paper, academic paper, has ever been written in a peer-reviewed journal that argues this is how out of Africa migration happened, and this is how people went, and this is the evidence. Not a single paper. So the entire out of India theory has been an off-the-wall crank theory, which has never been taken seriously by anyone in academia. Now, the argument has no legs to stand on, because let's assume that there was such a migration that happened from India. When should it happen? It should happen after agriculture began, right, in the northwest. And agriculture, we now know from ancient DNA evidence, is a mixed population of first Indians and a population related to West Asian agriculturists. Now let us say that there is indeed a major migration that happened from this West Asia to Central Asia and Europe. What would you expect to see? You would expect to see the ancestry of the first Indians who are part of the population in Harappan. You would expect to see the ancestry of the first Indians to be spread from India, from northwestern India, all the way up to Europe. Is there such a evidence? None whatsoever. In fact, the ancestry of the first Indians who arrived here 65,000 years ago is unique to India. I mean India in the entire South Asia, in the old sense of all of South Asia. It is unique to South Asia. And In fact, there is another evidence which again suggests that if when there was an actual migration from India, it did carry the signal of the first Indians. What is this migration? It's a migration of the people called, we now know that the Roma, who were the people who were earlier called the Gypsies, we now know that they came from northwestern India. There are millions of them, couple of million in Europe, and now they are in the US as well. And when you study that DNA today, you can find the ancestry of the first Indians. So when there is an actual migration, you can see it. But remember that this happened only around 500 AD, long before the Indo-European languages spread out. So they could not have been spreading Indo-European languages. So the fact is that there's never been a scientific paper, peer-reviewed paper, that argued out of India, and these genetic evidences clearly suggest that that's completely unfeasible. There has never been archaeological evidence for that in any case. Now the question which you asked, which is why is there a problem? I think I will need to step back and say a few things. What do these new findings tell us really? And these are stunning new findings which we did not know earlier. Point number one is that now we know that no matter where in the caste hierarchy you stand, no matter what language you speak, no matter which part of the South Asia you inhabit, no matter obviously what religion you belong to, almost all population groups in South Asia carry 50 to 65% of their ancestry from the first Indians. So the question that we used to ask earlier, where do I have to go, where do we find the ancestry of the people who came here first? The answer that we now have is look in the mirror and look around. So that's the answer. This is significant. This fundamentally changes our understanding about ourselves. The rest of the population, for example, used to look at the tribals as someone very, very different from them. Now we know that as far as South Asia is concerned, the South Asian population, no matter who you are, they have no closer relatives anywhere else in the world than the tribals. That's lesson number one. What's lesson number two? Lesson number two is that now we know that when the Harappan civilization declined around 1900 BCE, they spread both to what is today called North India and to South India. They spread to both. They just did not move down. First of all, the civilization declined because of a long drought, and they moved to both sides. And they carried their pre-Aryan language, because the Harappan civilization existed before the arrival of the Indo-European language speaking area. So they took their pre-Aryan languages and their culture, their practices perfected in the crucible of the Harappan civilization across to all of these regions. And so today, if we can see many of those practices, that we could say that this is in many ways the glue, the cultural glue that holds us together. We may not realize it, but that's how it is. For example, the way houses are built around the courtyards, that's why are they done so? Because that's how the houses were built in the Harappan civilization. And why is the peepal tree considered sacred? You can see in the images of the seals in the Harappan civilization, there are images of perhaps a deity within the peepal tree, which people are paying obeisance to. So there are lots of similarities. There are images in the Harappan seals that remind you strongly of yoga. You must remember that you have to come to much later parts of you do not find any mention of the yoga in the Rig Veda, the earlier Sanskrit text. You had come much later when the mixing had happened. So one after the other, we now know that the Harappan civilization is the common heritage of all Indians. And they carried with them not only their genetic ancestry, they are their ancestors of all of India. And not only that heritage is not merely genetic, it is also genetic as well as cultural. And their language, which is likely to have been Proto-Dravidian, survived only in the south. In the north, they got overlaid by the language of the incoming migrants, which is Indo-European. But this means that the Harappan civilization, which really we never really connected to in our histories, we read about it as like we read about the Mesopotamians or the Egyptians. Now we know, no, it's our history. It's the foundational source of our civilization. So this is the third. We also now know that in the 2000 years between 2000 BCE and the beginning of the Common Era, there was mixing between the migrant groups of the kind that never happened before nor later. So you should remember that if anybody were to ask us which is the most tumultuous epochal period in the history of India, there should be zero doubt about the fact that it is between 2000 BCE and beginning of the Common Era. Why? Because think of all that happened. The Harappan civilization, which in its mature phase alone lasted 700 years, the largest civilization of its time, declined and people had to move. At the same time, there are people coming in from East Asia, bringing new languages and new farming practices. And it doesn't end there. There is another group of people coming from Central Asia who bring another set of languages and dominate northern India. And during this period, there is mixing between all four basic components of the Indian population of a kind that has never been seen before. There are only one group of people who did not participate in this, and those are the Andaman Islanders, because they did not see anything other than the first migration of out of Africa migrants. So today, if you look at any population group in India, no matter how remote a region, and if you were to look at the DNA, you will find it's a mixture of the multiple population migrations that have happened, and this is important. Now, why do I say it never happened after the Common Era began? Because that's also an important part of the story, our history, which is that geneticists now say that this mixing stopped around 100 CE, and the practice of endogamy began. And endogamy is the practice of marrying within one's own community, and we know that this is a distinguishing feature of the caste system. So now we have a rough idea of when the caste system fell in place. That's around 100 CE. And this changes our one common understanding held earlier, that the caste system began with the arrival of the Aryan. This is not true. We know that for 2000 years there was significant mixing. And caste system began around 100 CE. And we have to see it as a political development that happened around that time, when a new vision of how society should be organized took hold. The mechanics behind it, I look at some possible causations of how this might have developed. But this period is important. Now, what does this mean? This means that, okay, before going into what this means, it's also important to point out that the earliest verses, the earliest Sanskrit text that we have, Rig Veda, does not speak of a caste system. In fact, many of the rishis are sons of people who would later be considered lower caste. And there's only one sukta in the whole of the Rig Veda that is sometimes picked up to say that it mentioned caste system. It is called Purusha Sukta in Mandala 10, which itself is one of the later compositions, which talks about Vaishya came from the thighs, etc., etc. But most experts today agree that it's likely to have been inserted much later to justify a system that was later evolving. And so what this means is that the caste system as we know it has no legs to stand on, neither on the basis of genetics, because Ambedkar was right in saying that we are not different races, because population mixing had happened significantly by the time the caste system fell in place. It also means, so therefore the caste system has no basis to stand on neither on a genetic basis, neither is it divinely ordained, because you don't see it in the Rig Veda, nor is it genetically ordained. So now you can see where the opposition comes from.
Right. Is it though fair to say that there was a certain type of social organization among the incoming Aryans, a sort of a proto-Varna system, which I say this because some scholars have argued that it's the signal, the genetic signal of the incoming Aryans is much stronger in the upper caste. So there was some idea of division, there was mixing, I totally, that's very clear, but there is some division of roles, certain set of social hierarchy, porous hierarchy, but which then later evolved into a more structured caste system.
That's a very good question and very sharp. I think the way to deal with it is we usually think of, when you say a migration, especially the idea of migration, we usually think of it as homogeneous in some way and usually as happening within a small period. What we have to keep in mind is that we are talking about many centuries. We are talking about multiple groups who themselves were in conflict with each other, which we know from the earliest Vedas. And it's unlikely that they had the same or similar approach, social approach or ideas, which we know from later events. I will just talk about one example. In around 150 BCE, Patanjali asks a question, which is the land of the Arya? And he answers it himself. He says, it's below the Himalayas, it's above the Vindhyas, it's to the west, it is where the Saraswati disappears, and to the east, it's where the Kalaka forest is, which is generally assumed to be the confluence of Ganga and Yamuna. So essentially, in 550 CE, the areas to the east of the confluence of Ganga and Yamuna are not Aryavarta, they are Mlecha Desha. But you should remember that this does not mean at this point of time this area is uninhabited. It is in fact heavily inhabited, and by Indo-European speaking people who call themselves Arya, right? And this is the region where the second urbanization happened and large empires arose for the first time, which is the Nandas and then the Maurya, and most of all the new religions, the ferment of philosophical ferment of Jainism, of Buddhism, of Ajivikism, all that is happening where? It's happening in this broad region called Magadha. And to the Patanjali, that's not the land of the Arya. So what it means is that the common understanding that there is one homogeneous Arya society which all followed one kind of structure may not be realistic, and it is possible that one of the groups in a smaller part of the country which they migrated to did keep not mixing, had a much more conservative approach to life, both in terms of mixing with others, which the Magadhan people did not seem to have had, and also in terms of language purity, not letting it mixed with other languages, which again the Magathans don't seem to have had, which is why they were also called Mlechas.
Great. Let's take a couple of questions.
We'll start with...
Hi, thank you. So my question was about Aryan culture, and there is some suggestion that it was a very strongly patriarchal culture. Of the Yamnaya originally, who moved both east and west.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could speak to, is there any evidence in the genetics or archaeology or textual evidence of what effects their patriarchy have brought to India?
Yeah, 2-3 pieces of good question. One, we have strong evidence from the steppe migrations into Europe that they... Hello? Yeah, that it was a strongly patriarchal culture. From the burials, the Beja burials are male, and they are buried with, they often, when they are buried, they often have major injuries to their head, buried with major pieces of weapons. All of this suggests a very violent and very patriarchal society, or that was moving into Europe at that time. In fact, Marija Gimbutas, who was a major historian, used to say, had the thesis that before the migrations into Europe, Europe had a very much more of a mother goddess culture, and that changed with the arrival This is a controversial, I mean, some people do not agree with this, but that there is such a proposal. Now, do we have such evidence for India? No. We do not have any such material evidence to suggest that it was patriarchy or not patriarchy. But there is a genetic piece of evidence that could suggest, which is that when you look at the male ancestry or the male haplogroup, what's called the Y haplogroup of the migrations from steppe is far higher than the female ancestry or mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA ancestry, which suggests that it could suggest two things. It could suggest that the people who came, the migrants, were more male dominated, but that need not be the only explanation. It could also be that if they were in a more dominant position in society, they would leave the males, they would leave a more of an ancestry behind over time. So this is the extent of the answer that one can give.
Tony, early in your in what you were saying, you said something about how the out of Africa migration amounted to about 200 individuals. I'm really intrigued by how we came up with that number. Why just 200? How do you know that?
It looks at, it could be more, this is just a guesstimate. It looks at the minimum number that you would need for a sustainable mating network. And also what the group, these are hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers moves in groups of 20 or 20 to 30. And you would need at least a group of 200 or 300, sustainable mating network, what you would call. Yes. So it could be more, but this is just a guesstimate. So, but the thing is that all of the rest of the population, around the world comes from a mtDNA ancestry. That's a female ancestry, a haplogroup called L3 that arose around 70,000 years ago. And Africa has many more L0, L1 goes on, many more haplogroups, but none of them were part of the original migration that went on to populate the rest of the world.
Well, this is a super interesting topic, but we are out of time. Thank you, Tony, for joining us here.